What's up everyone, Bildaran here for TBP, and today I will share you one of my favorite lines. I call it my killer line, and that's bad check snap. For years I played in a certain way, and so every time when I had some kind of middle pair with like a medium kicker, my plan was always to bet the turn small with the intention to check the river. And the main reason was to control the pot and not to face like a big river bet where I would have a tough decision. And well, even though I still think it's like a decent line, nowadays I don't use this line at all, basically, against recreationals, especially against recreationals. And what I use nowadays is the bad check snap line. And today I'm going into details, what exactly, what hands exactly we want to use for that line, in what kind of situations we want to use that line, and yeah, that's basically it. So let's start. As always, we are going to explore the population stats, right? This is basically our baseline, and we start with the heads up big blind, because this line you can apply in a lot of situations. And today we are going to focus on the heads up big blind, and then on a three-way big blind versus button and small blind versus button, right? So our opponent is in the big blind and we are in the heads up small blind. And on the left side you see the bet sizes that our opponent uses after he check called the flop, right? So he's in the big blind, we are in the small blind, he's check calling the flop, then he's checking and we are checking back, and then our opponent is betting the river. This line is also called probe river, right? So our opponent is probing the river. And on the left side, you see the distribution of our opponents when he's using different sizings, right? So here, for example, in 16% of the time, or with 16% of his range, he's using a sizing between 25 and 45%. And here you see how often he has a different type of hands, right? So for example, this one here, the red one, is how often he has a 2-pair plus. This is the top pair, this is the middle pair, this is the low pair, this is a misdraw, and this is total trash, right? And so the main sizes, or the main sizings that our opponents are using, are first a small size, right? Then they have like a medium size, not really 50%, but between 60 and 70. So I guess mainly like 65%. This is also, for example, on Winamax, and I think also on PokerStars, you have like 2/3 pot as like a standard button. So that's getting used quite frequently. And then a pot bet, right? So between 90 and 100%. This is getting used as well. On the right side, you see the same, but in race pots. And kind of surprising that it's almost always the same distribution. And not only for the percentages, how often our opponents are using the different bet sizes, but also how the ranges are distributed. And yeah, so I think these graphs are fine, but we are going into more details in the heads up big blind limp pots, so you can see the distribution even a little bit better. Okay, good. So what I did here, basically in your HUD, when you hover over these, then you see the hands, all of these hands, right? So that's what you're going to see in the next ones. So we are going to analyze the pot bet, the 66% bet, and this is usually a 33% bet, right? So you see it here. On the left side, this is when our opponent is using a pot bet, right? So he's check calling the flop, is going check check, and then he's potting the river. And this is when our opponent is using a 66% size. and this is when our opponent is using the 33% size. And here you see how often our opponent has like a 2 pair plus, right? So a very strong hand. How often he has a mid pair, a top pair, low pairs, misdraws, etc. And here on the bottom, just for everyone who is not like extremely well in math, I put in a table where you can see how often our opponent has to have a bluff for us to have a profitable call, right? So there are some principles, right? So if our opponent is betting pot, full pot, he can have 67% of his range should be value bets and 33% of his range should be bluffs to make us indifferent, right? So this is like the indifference principle that is getting used, right? So our opponent has usually GTO wise a perfect ratio of value hands to bluffs, and we should defend properly with our range. But this is not really how we should think. I think most important is how often we have to win as a caller to make a profitable call, right? So this one here is basically the most important table. And so if our opponent is betting full pot, we need to win in 33% of the time or more to make a profitable call. And when our opponent is betting 66% of the time, we need to win in 28% or more to make a profitable call. And when our opponent is betting just small, 33% of the time, like of a pot, then we need to win in 20% of the time or more to make a profitable call. And well, so there's one very interesting thing, and that's in theory, right? So in theory, the lower our bet size is, the less bluffs we can have, right? So when we just bet very tiny, then most of our hands should be value hands, and we shouldn't have too many bluffs because our opponent is supposed to call very, very often. So we can't really fill our value bets with bluffs. And the bigger we bet, the more bluffs we can add in relation, the ratio between our value bets and our bluffs can be a little bit more bluff heavy, right? You see it here. When we bet small, we can only have 20% of our range should be bluffs in theory, and when we bet like 66%, it should be 28%, and when we bet full pot, it should be 33%. But if we take a look at the real distribution, you see that the smaller our opponent is betting, right? So here he is betting 33% of the time, and the ratio of value bets, right? So 2 pair plus, let's add top pairs, etc. as well. Then in around 30% of the time, our opponent has a top pair or better. Only in 30% of the time, right? And that also means that in 70% of the time, our opponent just has trash, misdraw, and most of the time just a low pair, right? So, and then if our opponent is betting 66% of the time, he has more value hands, right? So more value bets, more often a 2 pair plus. So here in total it is around 47-48%. That means in 52% of the time he has a mid pair or worse, right? If you put a mid pair as a value bet as well, then it is around like 60 something percent of the time, but it's still like a bluff in around like 40 something percent of the time, right? And if our opponent is betting full pot, then his range is the strongest, and he has in around like 55%. If you add middle pairs, then in around like 60 something percent, he has a value bet. But still, he's bluffing around 10, 20, 30, around 40% of the time, right? So all three sizings from our opponent are heavily overbluffed. Not just a little bit, but really, really extreme. And you see it here, for example, 1/3 pot, our opponent, if we beat a low pair, then we are good in around like 60% of the time, right? That's insane, because we only need to be good in 20% of the time. So we win the pot 40% more often than we are supposed to. It's getting a little bit worse when the sizings that our opponents are using are getting bigger, but we are also winning bigger pots, right? So if our opponent's betting 66% of the time, or of 66% of a pot, then we still win if we beat, let's say we beat a low pair, right? Then we win in 20, 30, 40, in around 40, 44, 45% of the time. And we are only supposed to, we only need to win in 28% of the time. So let's say even if we have an ace high and every draw busts, for example, right? And our opponent is betting this 66% pot size, then we have to exclude low pairs, right? We have to exclude low pairs because we are not beating them, but we are beating missed draws and missed trash, and that's still around 30, 31% of the time. So we usually still have a profitable call very often, but we kind of need to be a little bit more careful and pick the situations, right? So the more draws busts, the better the situation is for your ace high calls, sometimes even king high calls, right? So it depends what kind of hands our opponent can have. And well, if our opponent is betting full pot, then we will lose more often than we'll win, but we still have a highly profitable call, right? So we shouldn't be nits in this situation, and that's actually what I have been for a very long time. I was basically overfolding these spots because I didn't have this knowledge, and that's why I always did bet the like smallish on the turn with my like mid pairs and no kicker, etc. Just to control the pot and to not face these situations where my opponent is betting big and then I have some kind of like guessing game. But it's actually, if you have the information, it's not a guessing game anymore, right? So nowadays I actually force my opponents to get into these lines, right? So that's my goal. On the flop already, I have a plan. I know, okay, with this hand, I want to bet the flop with the intention to check the turn and to catch to call the river, right? So I construct my ranges in a way when I, for example, when I can't bluff catch the river, then I rather turn my hand into a bluff and play bet turn, bet river on a lot of runouts. But if I have a mid pair, no kicker, then most of the time I still see bet the flop, but then I check back the turn with the intention to call the river. And this is amazing because on the river you just snap call because you know, okay, average opponent is overfolding here, is over bluffing heavily, and this is always a very good spot. Oh, good, but let's go into a little bit more details. And three-way, it's basically the same, right? This is when we are on the button, we are raising, and the small blind or the big blind is calling, and then we are c-betting the flop. And when we have some mid pair or we have nothing, or we are picking up a mid pair, then just check back the turn and call the river, because here the distribution is pretty similar, right? If our opponent's betting small, you see here now a lot of bottom pairs, but also a lot of like trashy hands, and not very often a 2-pair plus. If our opponent is betting 66% of the time, it's kind of similar. Of course, he has a little bit more top pairs. I would say in around like 45% of the time or something like that. And if our opponent is betting full pot, then again, like between 50 and 60% of the time, our opponent has 2-pair plus, but still 40% is more than sufficient to make these calls. Sometimes you will have pretty bad card distributions and you feel as if your opponent is just value towning you all the time, and then he has his like trips, etc. But there will be also times where you catch your opponent and you win like 10 out of 10 times. So yes, there's a little bit of variance included, but like I said, I don't bet small the turn, basically never. Maybe with some bottom pairs it might make some sense because we don't really beat these. Bluff catching with the bottom pairs doesn't make too much sense because we then block a lot of our potential yeah, like potential bets from our opponents. So with these hands, betting small might make some sense, right? But not with the mid pairs. Mid pair no kicker, that doesn't really matter. Yeah, so big blind versus button, it's the same. And yeah, here it's even cool that our opponents are using the 60 to 70% most of the time. And yes, so when you take a look at this distribution, you see that yeah, around 50% of the time they even have like pure air. This is the best size that we can face, right? So if someone is betting two-thirds pot and he's a recreational, then just never fold if you have some hand that beats his like busted draws or beating a low pair. Okay, so let's sum it up a little bit, right? So let's put it together. Fish over bluff heavily on all bet sizes. And yeah, like I said, like the theory is the bigger your bet size, the more bluffs you can have. And the reality is the bigger the bet size, the less bluffs people have, right? So it's the total opposite. And yeah, so one thing you need to keep in mind here is that fish actually bet a lot with low pairs. Doesn't make sense at all, but they do, right? And still unclear if it's a bluff or if these are like bluffs or value bet. I think they just bet, right? So it's it's kind of weird line that they're picking here, but this is how it is. And also doesn't really matter what exactly they think in this situation. We just want to take advantage of it. Okay, so that's for the theoretical part. I kept it very small and crisp because we just pick a very specific line. And what we are doing next is put this all into practice, and I show you plenty of spots now where I did use this line and try to explain it as good as possible. So see you in a second.